One, two, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Hey everybody, it's the Sales Hacker Podcast and your host Sam Jacobs. Hope you're doing well out there. Today's episode is from a virtual offsite that the Revenue Collective did back on March 10th. We were originally going to have an in-person event, but like everything in the world, it got upended by coronavirus, unfortunately. And so we transitioned into a virtual event, and we interviewed the president and chief operating officer of InsightSquared, Todd Abbott. And Todd and I discuss over the course of this offsite and this session the reasons that we're all running our forecasting and pipeline and funnel reviews in the wrong way, because we're reliant on reps inputting manual data. And what we really need to do is find systems that automate the input of data so that we can spend our time coaching reps and really guiding them to better performance. Of course, InsightSquared sells a solution that does that, so let's call that out in the open. They were a sponsor of the event, but nevertheless, it's a really important and relevant discussion. Before we get there, we want to thank our sponsor. Our sponsor is Outreach. Outreach humanizes communication at scale and supports sales reps. From automating the soul-sucking manual work that eats up selling time to providing action-oriented tips on what communications are working best, Outreach has your back. If you're out there and you're listening to this, I'm recording this on March 18th. There's a delay when you listen to the Sales Hacker Podcast, and so sometimes it's a little dissonant. There was one episode where I said the conference is happening next week, and then you listen to it and we're all sitting at home. So I hope in the future, when you're listening to this, and I think it's the first week of April, that we've got a handle on this and that we're running tests at a large scale and that we really have a good understanding of the virus and the disease more effectively so that we can start to think about how to move forward through it. But regardless, I hope you're healthy and safe. I hope your loved ones are healthy and safe, and I hope you enjoy the interview. Thanks so much for listening to the show.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is session number 3, and I'm delighted to have with me today Todd Abbott, who's the president and chief operating officer of a company that many of us are customers of and that we all are great admirers of, which is InsightSquared, which in my opinion, and Todd will give us the official elevator pitch, but in my opinion, oftentimes makes Salesforce and our CRM systems usable. So, which is a good thing, I think. I'll quickly tell you his background. He's a seasoned sales and marketing executive who's led both large and small multinational organizations, including 6 years living and leading teams abroad in both Asia and Europe. He's got experience at Cisco, Avaya, and Mitel. Todd brings a unique perspective to the acquired partnership between the sales, marketing, customer service, and customer service experiences and the drivers behind revenue operations. Todd, thanks so much for joining us for our spring virtual offsite. Welcome.
Great to be here. Thanks for the opportunity.
We're super excited for it. So we want to give you the opportunity to give us the elevator pitch for InsightSquared. And there are folks out there who don't know what InsightSquared does. Tell us what you do. Tell us a little bit about the organization and then your role, because I know that your background is in sales, but you've got the coveted COO title and president. And so all of us are going to be curious, how do we get the president and COO title? So tell us about InsightSquared, and then we'll dive into your background.
Yeah, so it's a company that's been around about 9.5 years. Really started as a business intelligence tool to front-end Salesforce to get the data out of it for sales leaders to really understand what's going on in their funnel, to be able to manage the funnel development process. Salesforce, great tool from a data standpoint, but its reporting is very static, very difficult. And I frankly got exposed to them. I was a 3-time customer. I moved from a large company to a small, and in large companies, we have big sales ops staffs that do big data dumps that got me everything I needed. But what InsightSquared does is it basically kind of eliminates that need by giving you all of the reporting you need out of the box. And the beauty is that it's very simple and user interface that enables each sales leader within a function. So first-line sales managers may want to look at things a little differently. I don't need a big IT staff to be able to really understand how my team is doing in developing their funnel. So that's how we've started. I was a 3-time customer, and frankly, I joined because of an acquisition they made of a company called Alono that I think has the opportunity to fundamentally change the game relative to how we do funnel reviews and how we manage our teams through the sales process improvement game.
We're going to dive into funnel reviews because I know you have some great insights there. But let's start a little bit at the beginning just so we can contextualize, your background and your expertise. How long have you been doing sales? Where'd you start off? And specifically, and how'd you end up at? And you mentioned an acquisition, but walk us through a little bit of your career journey so we can get a sense for it.
Yeah, so I started as a big company guy right out of school, joining IBM. That's where I kind of learned the sales trade. So I was a large account salesman who moved up the management ranks, finished up in New York City, and I left IBM after going through 3 restructurings and joined a small company at the time called Cisco Systems. And wow, you just talk about cultural changes. Woof. At the time, Cisco didn't hire managers, so I literally stepped down from a director to carrying a bag in New York City, and that was just a great run. Moved up through the ranks pretty quickly, and as you indicated, went over to Asia, ran South Asia, and then ran the service provider business in Europe. And then from there, I got on this track of doing transformations, if you will, companies that really were either modifying their go-to-markets or just trying to change their culture or had stalled. And so I've been doing a bunch of transformations of companies, taking the disciplines I learned at Cisco about sales process and sales management systems and translating it into different industries. And it's been, frankly, a great ride since.
When you say transformation and that you became known as, like, what are the key tenets? How do you transform an organization? And should we interpret transformation as also partially euphemism for kind of a turnaround person, somebody that goes into an organization that's not performing well and helps them restructure in order so that they can do well?
Yeah, I think that's a good translation. Typically, companies that have kind of hit a stall or are really just trying to change their business model. I mean, most recently at Mitel, moving from a premise-based to a cloud unified communication as a service base. So, I really consider myself a go-to-market guy who has just stayed really grounded in the rep, in the people that are the front line dealing with customers and understanding how to transform their focus, the execution of the business, whether it's moving from a direct to a channel play or moving from an on-site to a cloud play. The big aspect of taking a strategy, leveraging your skill sets as a company, figuring out where you want to go to, and then how do you get there? I mean, it never happens quick. It's typically a 2 to 3 year process that requires strategy change, process change, culture change. And so it's really about trying to take a business that's stalled or struggling and moving it into a growth phase.
Obviously every business is completely different and unique, but if you had to characterize some of the common reasons why companies hit a stall point, in your perspective or your opinion, what do you think those are?
I think that it's really hard for executive teams to stay really grounded as to what your capabilities are and where to use the Wayne Gretzky analogy, where the puck's going to go and how do you, what aspect of where that puck's going to be can you compete and how do you get an organization aligned to that change? I mean, the hardest part with transformations are companies typically were successful, but what got them to be successful and what's going to require to be successful in the transformed new world, because things are changing so rapidly, you have to redefine great. And too many times leadership just continues to do what they're doing without the real foresight and the ability to communicate to a large organization. Hey, as good as we are, if we don't change, it's eat or get eaten, right? You will become sub-optimized. And so how do you drive this continuous improvement in a change culture? And the hardest part is just helping people understand why we were great, why we're not going to be great if we keep doing things the way we're going to do it. Here is the vision on how we have to change and why. Because if you get people to understand why we're changing and they buy in intellectually and emotionally, then you can empower them to go figure out what each function needs to do to be able to realign to the new definition of great. But it's at its root, it's a cultural that comes with being able to communicate the redefinition and then empowering them with the support and the processes that enable them to be successful in the new definition.
When you think about alignment, because we use, that word is oft used and hard to deliver against, is communication the central function or the central action that drives alignment? Is it incentives? Are you an advocate of reorganizing the incentive structure sometimes for different departments to make sure that they're hitting the same goals? What do you think facilitates and executes alignment?
Yeah, I mean, listen, compensation has a role, but I find that the biggest driver of change is, first of all, aligning everybody as to where we want to get to and why. I mean, that is like the ground. If you just put compensation without them understanding truly what we're trying to do, who we're competing against, what the market is, and and then what the definitions and measurements are of success through that process so it feeds itself. If you don't do that, then you'll suboptimize the ability to execute. I mean, if you have a good team, it's about really tapping into their brains about understanding what I have to do to participate in this transformation. And if I don't believe in where we're going, then you're going to get suboptimized. So the biggest challenge is to get people to truly believe the skill sets that they had as a company to be successful are going to be leverageable here, but we have to change. And you have to get your leadership team to buy into that. Once you do that, then putting measurement systems in place, and I think measurement systems in place in a management system actually drive better behavior than compensation. I'm always a believer of keep compensation really simple, but how I measure a team each week, each month, each quarter will drive much better behavior than frankly what I put in compensation.
I agree with that. I mean, there's been a lot of studies focused on how variable compensation specifically doesn't quite change behavior the way people assume that it does.
Yeah. I mean, if you identify the top things that we want a first line sales leadership team to do, and if they know they're going to get measured on those, whether it's weekly, monthly, or quarterly, and they're going to get benchmarked against their peers, that will drive behavior way better than putting MBOs and components in a compensation plan. So I was always a believer, and still am, that keep the compensation really simple, align it to the company financial goals, and then drive behavior through management systems and communication.
Agreed. To the point of, what you're doing at InsightSquared, one of the things that you're sort of, religious about or have a lot of enthusiasm is how we're doing kind of pipeline reviews and funnel reviews completely wrong. Tell us what you mean by that. What's the right way to do them? What's the wrong way to do them? And how do we change?
Yeah. So every time I've kind of had an opportunity to kind of do some thought, step back from the daily grind of being an operating executive, and I've had an opportunity a few times in my career, and I was doing it actually after having left Mitel. What became very clear to me as I was trying to understand the progress I had made or not made in getting good quality data out of the funnel is that we're really reliant on what the rep puts in CRM. And our CRM systems were never designed for the rep. They're not territory management systems. Their UIs are difficult. It's very time consuming for them to update opportunities. And if you think about the sales process as a manufacturing process, a manufacturing line, and you compare it to the amount of data and analytics you have in a manufacturing line, I mean, the efficiencies in driving costs out of every step in the manufacturing line is there because you have data. In the sales process, we have not had the data. And I've tried the carrot approach, the stick approach to get reps to give me the data. And what I've now realized is even if I was successful, I was still only going to get a very small subset of what they're actually doing in selling to their customer base in their territory. And so we've been devoid of the data to really provide great analytics as to what are my top 10, 20% reps really doing? And how do I replicate that in the other 80%? In fact, we typically give the best reps the most amount of latitude not to update CRM because they're the most administrative adverse and they deliver, so don't burden them. But actually, that's the data we need. And so the analytics around the sales process is actually so much further behind than the analytics of processes virtually in every aspect of the company. And if you don't have the data, then what's happening in funnel reviews is managers are just spending the hour one-on-one, just kind of sorting through the data to try to figure out what's real, what's not, having frustrating conversations with reps. That's out of date. You did this, you need to move. You didn't update this from the last call. It's more a data cleansing process versus what the funnel review was always intended to do was to coach the reps on sales execution. How do I help you improve your win rate, your conversion rate? And in order to do that, you need the data. But what we've moved into at this stage is they're just funnel cleanup activities. And it's because we don't have the data. So we've got to fundamentally change the model.
So how do we get the data? What should we do?
So there's great technology out there now to be able to intercept emails and meetings and file shares that we can literally take the vast majority of the administrative burden off the rep. And once you have that data and with an easy front end to be able to mask the difficult interface of Salesforce.com, if that's your CRM system, if you have the data, now I can provide analytics to that rep and to that manager and prompt them to take sales actions, to interject tactics do data cleanup on a daily basis. So it's not a once a month process. And I now walk into a funnel review with a totally different data set and with machine learning assisted guidance to know what to focus on, what not. Like, I'll give you an example. I mean, how many times does a manager spend time? Really what you're doing is you're really trying to look at into the hearts and minds of the rep. Do I share his or her confidence with this deal? And you're basically going on everything the rep tells you with no data to back it up. And some reps are very aggressive. Some are hopeful, and some are sandbaggers, right? And so how do you sort through that mess so that I, as a manager, can truly understand what I have in my funnel, where I can coach, and most importantly, where I need to what to forecast? Because what everybody is entering into is this anxiety. I've just got to get what I need to forecast, because that's my job tenure is based on that. If I can't forecast accurately, my tenure is probably pretty short, right? I mean, the CRO's tenure right now is about 18 months. And if they can't get at what the true forecast is to set expectations, that's when tenure goes short. So I've got to get the data in the system to start doing analytics to clean up this funnel process so I can ultimately forecast. That's kind of like the short-term benefit. But what the real benefit is I get the manager back to coaching. And now we're back to sales process improvement, which is what the funnel was always intended to do, the funnel review.
I completely agree. When you work at a company that is ingesting all this data, finding patterns, finding insights. I mean, you're finding the square of insights, apparently, based on the name of the company. There are still many, many folks, in the absence of anything else, it's just pure activity-based kind of, KPIs, at least on the input level. Obviously, the output is, how much business did you close and at what, and how long did it take and what's your win rate? But going into it, it's still how many calls did you make? How many emails did you send? And yet when we look at top reps, at least on the sales development side, they're often not the people that are sending the most emails or making the most phone calls. They're just doing a lot more research and personalization. Have you found any interesting insights around predictors of success based on the data that you have at InsightSquared that you can share with the audience, or is it still just a function of how hard you work, what time you get into the office, and the person that makes 100 phone calls is going to beat the person that makes 90 phone calls?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. What I'm actually finding now, most of us have come from a world where you want to hire the best people, come with the best Rolodex, the superstars. And in reality, if you put a sales process, and to use that production analogy, in place, and you really understand what great looks like, you can take a team of B players and outperform a team that has a typical bell curve of some really star performers and some mediocres. Because as the sales cycles have gotten shorter with the SaaS solution sets, it's really about the process versus the superstars. And so what we have found is that the number one indicator of the health of a deal is the level of activity. Now, it's not just numbers of emails, it's also types of activities. And it's actually the engagement between the customer. If there's a lot of two-way traffic, you've got a really good deal because the customer's engaged. Now, we can now start to study, when does that two-way engagement become important, and who does the two-way engagement need to be with, right? So like, as an example, we've identified with one of our customers that's got an average 6 meeting on a deal that's won. But if the CRO isn't engaged by meeting 3, the win rate goes down exponentially. So if I know that, then in my coaching on a deal, and if the system will help me understand the CRO is not involved, 4th meeting scheduled, I've got a coaching opportunity that I wouldn't know if I didn't have that data of the insights, and then the ability to see a deal with that insight, right? Another great example is that I had a customer who had a 90-day sales cycle, and what they identified through the activity analytics is that the best reps, the top 15%, they were cutting deals after 4 months, because they recognized intuitively, and it was actually intuitive because as we went and talked to them, it was just intuitive that my best reps understood after 4 months if it was time to cut bait and go to the next one. And then if you looked at the next 80%, they had deals that were out there 4 months, 5 months. And actually, the lower you went from a performance standpoint, the longer the tail of deals, because the most struggling reps are the last ones that want to give a deal up. And so if I know that as a management team, and I can see what types of activities actually need to take place at the 60-day mark, don't wait till the 90-day mark. The profile of activities, the type of activities, the engagement, you can start to get really early indicators as to the health of a deal for your coaching, and to know, is your funnel building with the right level of quality to be able to translate to your forecast. And so that's the kind of analytics that we've got to get into this process. And if you present that to the rep, actually, one of the reactions I get a lot is, well, this is Big Brother. The machine is taking over for the rep. No, actually, what we're doing is eliminate the noise. So your best reps are getting the insights to be able to actually even be better. And your managers, you eliminate all the noise, so I know what to go focus on based upon what I've learned in the insights of my business. But it's all based upon having the data. And you just can't burden the reps to get that data. You're never going to get the quality or the extent of the data that you need.
This episode of the Sales Hacker Podcast is brought to you by DocuSign. Every sales org feels the pressure to close deals faster. Take control with the DocuSign Agreement Cloud, a suite of tools that automate sales contracts and quotes all in your CRM. Create custom contracts, get them signed, and pull data back into your opportunities. See why more than 500,000 businesses use DocuSign with a free trial and discount exclusively for Sales Hacker listeners. Go to go.docusign.com/saleshacker for more information. Our second sponsor is Outreach, the leading sales engagement platform. Outreach supports sales reps by enabling them to humanize their communications at scale, from automating the soul-sucking manual work that eats up selling time to providing action-oriented tips on what communications are working best. Outreach has your back. And now, back to the show.
So there's folks out there that are listening and nodding their heads. And I know that, part of the work that y'all are doing around thought leadership is around defining this concept of revenue operations that links sales, customer success, and marketing. There's a few words that we use in our universe that are still not completely defined. One of them is marketing, actually. Another is enablement. And then another is kind of sales operations or revenue operations. What does it mean? What are the actual responsibilities of the person or function that I've staffed to do that? In your mind, a tier A revenue operations function, what are the things that it does? And what are the deliverables back to the organization that the organization relies on when the RevOps function is performing at a high level?
Yeah, so I think I would provide a little bit of context on the answer I'm going to give you, because if you think about, I'm a big believer, if you know how we got to where we got to, then you enable people to think about things differently in that same context of what does great look like tomorrow. So having each function, marketing having its own marketing ops function and sales having its own sales ops function, has worked really well in the B2B world when you had sales cycles that were 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. And I grew up in that world, and marketing had its plans and they did their seminars, but I was less dependent on what I needed from a lead standpoint within a forecast period. As the sales cycles have come down, the demand for quality leads into the sales process to be able to meet my monthly or quarterly objectives, it's become much more critical. And what we have found is that what might have been tolerable in different definitions of MQLs and what's the SLA and how good quality is it, that noise, that friction can't be tolerated in a SaaS world where you've got so much in-period business that needs to be identified and closed. And so the friction has identified the fact that we need to take the noise out of the system. And so RevOps is really, whether it's a hard organization or a virtual organization, is having one set of ownerships of what's the tool stack across that production line, from not just leads to sales to customer success. You've got to look at the journey of that customer from lead to renewal. And how do you break down the communication and teamwork across all your functions and interfacing to that process? Well, the first thing you got to do is have one common strategy on the tech stack, one common strategy on the definitions of the handoffs, one common strategy on the measurement of that production line. It'd be like thinking of it, go back to the production line example. If you had multiple owners of a production line and you had handoffs, the production line's never going to work effectively. So with this sales process condensing to a shorter period, we're now faced with the need to have a highly efficient process from marketing all the way through to renewal. And so RevOps is the recognition of that, and first looking at the process, the tech stack, and the strategy to enable that end-to-end game of the customer.
And sort of to your point, because I think just to drive the point home a little bit, if sales uses the word lead and it means something, and then marketing uses the word lead and it means something subtly different, that's where breakdowns and handoffs, and that's sort of the point of a great RevOps function is one set of numbers, one set of definitions, one common language with which to report out to the organization.
And one common tool stack to report at it. So if in the old world, I've had this experience. I'm sure many of the people listening, marketing would have a definition, but they would change it, and I would know about it for 30 days later. And so that's happened to me a million times. And they would have debates of, well, you're not really following up, and so what's the SLA, and how are you measuring that? So the how are you measuring that is just noise that you can't tolerate anymore. And so if you take the ownership across the board, then I have one throat to choke. I mean, I literally just had a meeting with my RevOps leader earlier this week because there was some friction on some elements. And my guidance to him is, hey, mate, you own that. So I need you to be as impatient with noise of handoffs of the production line as you possibly can, because noise to me is friction, and friction is lack of execution on optimizing how well we're operating across the functions. And you just have to have a relentless impatience for that noise, that friction.
From your lips to God's ears. One of the things you've talked about, and that's again, we talk about, you already mentioned the stat, Revenue Collective has an obsession with this notion of declining tenure. And you've talked about the declining lifespan of a CRO. Tell us what you think is driving it. And then, not to be too overly negative, the COO, the president and COO role, as I understand it, is oftentimes the goal of a lot of us, because it's sort of the de facto number 2 in the organization. Would love to hear how you found your way to that role and what you think the difference is between being a president and COO and being a CRO, and how more CROs can make that leap to counteract the declining lifespan, tying it all together.
Yeah. So, I mean, the first part of your question is one I've thought a lot about. So why is this life cycle of a CRO? And I've seen the play a number of times where if a business is struggling, oftentimes shooting the CRO is the CEO's path to lasting another 6 months. Because if we're not executing the top line, it's got to be a sales role. It's almost very similar to the way we used to run the business in a B2B world. If somebody wasn't executing, it must be the person, versus now we need to have the reaction of it's not the person, it's the process. And I think what fundamentally I've concluded is that most CEOs and most CFOs don't understand the sales process. And we've done ourselves a disservice as a function by not having a sales process with those same metrics to be able to identify when we're missing, why are we missing? If I have this analytics to be able to say, hey, the quality of my funnel is different today than it was at the start of last quarter, that's an alert. I need to know that early. So why is it different? And what do I do differently? And to be able to have transparency across the company allows people to understand that this sales game is about a process. It's not this big black amorphous that I don't really understand because I didn't come up through sales and I pay you guys the most amount of money. And if you're not executing, then I must be you. I got to get somebody else. Well, let's look at the process and be able to give them the visibility ahead of time. It would be irresponsible for a CFO to have an ops leader running a manufacturing line without the data to understand how is the manufacturing running. But in fact, that's where we are today in most cases. So I think the analytics and the analysis and the insights gives the CRO the ability to take control of the company's execution, because we're always so dependent upon so many other functions in the company. But if you now have the process and you can document and you have the analytics and the insights, you can take control of where the execution is or isn't much earlier in the process and take ownership for the rest of the company being aligned. And so that's, I think, the answer to tilting this and making them more part of the process without really understanding, what sales is all about. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, no, my question was just specifically to you. So you meant, how did you make the leap from being thought of potentially as, a sales leader or exclusively a sales leader? And we're always trying to avoid that phrase coin operated, or at least I am, because I think it's not a compliment. It seems to be a pejorative. How'd you make the leap to be president and COO? What do you, when you look at and try to attribute success, do you think it's this emphasis on analytics? Are there other factors that came into play, in your opinion?
So I've always been very intellectually curious on driving cross-functional execution. And so I've gone and spent a good part of my career at understanding the different components of the business that I was dependent upon. And then I've always taken it upon myself to really help the other functions understand the cause and effect of lack of alignment. The hardest thing is, frankly, to drive influence horizontally. And so I've tried in my career to help people understand when marketing does this, or product quality is this, or the product delayed is this. Hey, here's the effect. I'm not a magician. I can't make up for everybody missing their pieces to deliver the execution for the company. And so the more time that I found I spent helping people to understand the cause and effect so that there was transparency and accountability on those dependencies has enabled me to get a much broader perspective than just driving sales. And so if you want to be a COO or a president, you have to help the organization understand how all those dependencies work so you can deliver for the company. And the more you spend time understanding how product delivers and how marketing launches and how support and how renewals needs to work, the more you do that as a collaborative peer cross-functionally, you'll learn so much more to be able to drive that end-to-end game. I think that would be my best advice is be a businessman first, businesswoman first, in understanding the dependencies and helping people to understand that. And that's how you then ultimately get to own those aspects of the organization.
So, and by the way, folks, if you're out there listening, we're about to move into questions. I've got a few more questions for Todd, but if you have questions, be thinking about them, or you can immediately start dropping them into the chat box, or there's an ask a question at the bottom. So please don't be shy. But Todd, if I'm reframing, I would love your reaction to this, and it doesn't have to be agreement, but it may be. The opposite of that, to your point, is so be a business person first, and then from there you can be a revenue person. And when you think about people that fail, or CROs or VPs of sales or even VPs of marketing that fall short and become victim to the declining tenure syndrome, it may be that's what they lack. I think I run into a lot of sales leaders or revenue leaders, and their perspective is, as long as I hit the number, my job is safe. When in reality, if they don't have a theory of business of why they hit the number and why they'll hit the next quarter's number, that's the thing that's going to guarantee longevity, not just the simple fact of did I achieve the goal or not. Agree or disagree?
100% agree. Yeah, I mean, I just had a good buddy of mine who just got shot because they did an acquisition, and the CEO had made commitments relative to what that acquisition was going to deliver, and I knew he was dead man walking 6 months before, because there's no way that plan was ever going to play. He didn't have the ability to be able to help the CRO and CEO from a process standpoint understand there was no way with this factory to deliver those results. And I know it now. I've lived it. I know it now. And the only way you can get out of that is by helping the company understand it's not about the people, it's about the process and what this process is able to deliver and the dependencies that the process has. I mean, if in manufacturing, I'll give you another great case in point, right? At some point in manufacturing, you couldn't get any more cost out until you started to drive design for manufacturability into engineering. There was inherent costs with how engineering was designing product. And so the next step function at some point was I had to go back upstream. Well, in sales, it's the same way. We have dependencies upstream. That's product, that's marketing, that's support execution. If your support team is not delivering great customer satisfaction and installations, there's not a sales team in the world that can overcome that at some point. So the more you help people understand the dependencies in a non-threatening, transparent way, the more I think you can take control over everybody understanding what this process and team can do. And it's not about you. It's about the company's execution. And if you got a CEO and a CFO that buys into that, then you'll blow through the 18 months and you'll be able to drive continuous improvement. If you don't, then you're probably part of the 18 months. And I've been with some CEOs where I was part of the 18 months because it was too black magic for them and they didn't want to understand. And that was the case with my buddy who just got shot.
last question before I ask you a question about what we're all dealing with coronavirus and the global pandemic. But so let's take that argument to one step or two steps further, which is that because I agree with you, right? If it's not about any heroic sales leader or revenue leader or marketing leader, it's not about the heroic Herculean efforts of any one or two reps. It's about the process, and the process links the entire company. It's the company's process, not just the sales process. Right. It's the overall process that has dependencies. Meanwhile, the CRO, is often, quote unquote, the highest paid person at the company. Do you think that impacts executive compensation? If a CEO believes that, he or she might say, I agree with you. Why can't we just pay you the same, what we pay all of our other executives? Let's not do quarterly commissions. Let's do an annual bonus, and let's win or lose together as a team, as opposed to having one random man or woman be, paid 50% more, 30% more than all of the other executives, if we truly believe that this is a function of a team-based effort that drives process. What do you think?
Listen, I think sales will always be the highest paid function. And I think if a CRO does what I just described from a process standpoint, they're actually increasing their value, because you then become a much even better effective translator of what's really going on in the market, right? Like, I typically have spent 50% of my time out on the road with partners, customers, and your own team. And I view my number one role is to translate what's really going on with our strategy, with our execution, both from a customer value prop and from a competitive standpoint. And so the ability to come back and translate that into the process, I think actually your value is going to go up. So I don't think it would have the reverse effect as you suggested as a potential outcome. I think your dependency and your value to the organization and your ability to be positioned as a president, COO, or CEO. I mean, what better skill than having the outbound focus and understanding and translation to understanding how to execute that in a process that's back up into the organization. It in essence is the COO job. You are executing the translation to product and process and people to maximize the opportunity in the market. It's the sweet spot of any company.
Absolutely. That makes sense. Last question, and folks, if you got questions out there, but my question is, what's InsightSquared doing about coronavirus? How are you all handling it?
Yeah.
What steps you're taking?
Right now, what we're doing is getting ready for what we'll most likely move to a work at home. We've tapped the brakes on hiring. We're only doing critical backfills right now because I think that we think that the economy here is going to take a hit. I think, fortunately, if you look at what some of the initial statuses of the early countries like South Korea and China, and I'm not by far an expert, but I think we're all reading up quite a bit. It looks like they've bottomed out here. So this is a 3 to 6 month kind of impact. I'm a little concerned on how we're handling it as a country and how underreported it is. And so it may take us a bit longer to get our arms around it. And so we think there's going to be an economic impact. And so it would be fiscally irresponsible for us not to tap the brakes on spend. And so we are tapping the brakes in anticipation of what's going to be a bit of a bumpy road. And we're trying to really determine the work at home versus in the office. Fortunately, we're already very video centric. So remote and virtual meetings is something that's already been part of our DNA. But the key thing right now, I guess the two takeaways are, we've tapped the brakes on only critical hiring, asking people to do a bit more relative to multiple roles with not backfilling, and getting technologically ready to make sure people have the right home situation and the right technology infrastructure. Because working at home for a BDR or a support center person is different than somebody from a marketing center. And so there's some technology things that we've got to make sure are in place to have a virtual single interface to a customer, and we're rapidly putting those plans in place.
A lot of folks have been talking about the work from home stuff, but it's interesting that you're commenting that you are immediately slowing hiring. So you are a believer in the Sequoia memo, as I think many of us have become.
100%.
We got a question from Scott Travis. At what stage, Todd, do you think it's appropriate to have a CRO where sales, marketing, and customer success all roll into that person? And do you have a CRO that reports to you at InsightSquared?
So I have, so I'll go in reverse order. So I have 2 sales leaders. I don't actually have a CRO. I chose to not backfill that one at this stage, just where we are as a company. And frankly, every time, my MO is to dive deep into the details on the process, understanding how my commercial team is selling and my enterprise team is selling. By the time I do bring in a CRO, I've got such in-depth knowledge that I can help that individual with a strategy that's in place, but also help them continue the execution. So my MO has always been, when I move into a new role, is to take on multiple hats to really get to know the team in the process. But ultimately, as we continue to grow, that will be a role that we'll fill. I've always loved having marketing report to me. I've had it in some cases, some big companies had it report and some not. And the reason that I've enjoyed it is, frankly, I can get the noise out of the system much better. If there's noise in the system and I've got a CEO that doesn't quite understand the process and isn't forcing that noise to get out, then it just takes longer for me to work cross-functionally from an influence standpoint, especially if I've got an old world marketing executive who doesn't necessarily understand that dependency. And I've experienced that. The RevOps function is a vehicle to frankly help support getting that noise out of the system, as I've talked about, right? So if you're a CRO and you've got that friction, I've been there, it's hard. I think you've got to bring in the CEO and you've got to focus on the process and the dependencies. If you can then translate that to a RevOps function, and most companies will typically start virtually. I choose not to. I have a RevOps team, and so all of the marketing ops, sales ops, and my customer success ops all report hardline into one individual. I'm not saying that's the right thing for everybody, but I just didn't want to waste time in getting the ownership of that process and get the friction out of the system quickly. But that is tends to be more of a political situation in each company. Marketing guys don't want to give up marketing ops. No, success, right? It controls their own destiny. And so people don't like to give it up. And so if you don't have an executive buy-in that's driving that process, then it's hard. I think the way you get there is by helping people. I keep going back to the same thing. If you help people understand your dependencies and the fact that this friction just can't be tolerated, if you want to be number one in your segment, and in order to be number one, you got to execute with speed. If you got friction in the system, then you're never going to be, or odds are you won't be setting the pace in the industry. And so if you got a CEO that you can get them to buy into that, that's your best tack.
Agreed. Last question, and then I'm going to slap in the URL for the next session, which is going to be all about coronavirus, for better or for worse. But Mike Davis asks, from a demand gen perspective, Todd, we are in the act, meaning his company, is in the act of building a dashboard of leads to measure lead source of origination and conversion to MQL. Any words of wisdom to share? The goal is to know how much it costs to generate X new opportunities and direct the spend accordingly, I assume by channel. So any words of wisdom as they're building out a lead dashboard and trying to figure out what does it cost to create an opportunity?
There's no silver bullet to that answer, Mike. I mean, we work with a bunch of customers on the marketing dashboards, and it really varies so much by the type of business, from a transactional to a long sale and multi-touch attribution. Where do you put the cost relative to the cost of a lead? I tend to think I think some companies try to spend too much time trying to get too scientific on that, and multi-touch attribution makes it so hard. That's my personal opinion. I have kind of swayed away from trying to get as defined or as scientific on that. And my focus is much more on what's the right mix, inbound versus outbound. Where are you spending on inbound versus outbound to be able to deliver the right ROI? And then just like in the sales process, what are the activities that are required within that lead? So how do I translate that lead to an SQL? There's a set of activities that are best practices and not in your organization. And do you really have the ability to understand and measure what those activities are to drive continuous improvement in lead conversion? So it's not as a pinpoint answer as I think, Mike, you're probably looking for. It's much more situational. We work with customers in developing those dashboards and those measurement systems on a case-by-case basis.
Fair enough. Todd, thanks so much for joining us. And this session will be syndicated out to the beautiful Sales Hacker podcast in due course. But if folks are listening and they're Revenue Collective members, which they are, I just Slacked you before the session. So are you available on Slack for one-on-one introductions or to answer questions if folks have follow-up questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure.
Okay. Fantastic. And Todd's a member of our Boston chapter. So if you're in Boston and you're allowed to meet people in person, then Todd might be. although you're in Miami right now. I think, right?
Oh no, actually, I'm in San Francisco right now, but I live in Miami, as you know, and go back and forth. But I'm in Boston quite a bit.
Fair enough. All right, so I'm pasting in the link to the next session focused on dealing with coronavirus. Reminder, folks, this is open to the general public. If you want to take that link and post it on LinkedIn, we'd love to help as many people as possible. We've got a great lineup coming up next. That includes Ashley Greck, Global Head of Sales from Square, Brian Kaplan, CRO of Vendela, and Brian O'Reilly, CRO of SmartLink. Todd, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks to InsightSquared for your ongoing support. And we'll begin promptly at 3 p.m. Eastern for the next session on coronavirus. So we'll see everybody in about 16 minutes. Thank you.
God bless. Thank you.
Hey folks, Sam Jacobs, Sam's Corner. Hope you liked that interview with Todd Abbott, President and COO of InsightSquared. I think that the central point that he makes, and it's one that I've thought about often, which is that, Salesforce, when you look at Salesforce, and it's a great company, et cetera, we don't have to, they get it, they're multi-billion-dollar Ohana. So, but I've always thought when you opened up Salesforce for the first time, and maybe it's different with Lightning, you understood that this was like Yahoo in 1995, which is you understand the idea, but you also understood that this was not going to be the way that it was going to end up. And that's the way I always felt about Salesforce, because it presumes, and CRM systems in general, to a large extent, and now we've got integration, so it's slowly changing, or maybe quickly changing, but they presume that you do something over on this side, and I'm waving my hand to the right, and then you record the fact that you did it on the left side. And it's just a very irregular, abnormal process of doing something like making a phone call and then clicking log call. I always thought that the real CRM, the real insight, the real intelligence would happen when the things you did were automatically converted into recordings and logged and manual in, whatever. They were logged and recorded and transcribed inside the CRM so that you didn't have to do the logging. And then patterns and habits and insights could be developed once that automatically happened. And I think InsightSquared is working on that. And I think a bunch of other companies are working on that. And that's the right thing to be working on, because I think the real thing will be really interesting is when opportunities are both created and closed based on kind of artificial intelligence, automated, oversight of activity. When it says, looks like you've been talking to Jim a lot. Jim works at ExxonMobil. I've created an opportunity for you because it feels like there's a sales conversation there. And meanwhile, it says, you know what? We've noticed that the response latency on this opportunity has really decreased. The people aren't writing you back. You haven't done anything in 30 days. You know what? We've automatically closed it. Let us know if that's an error. Of course, the rep will say, of course, it's still open, but you get my point. So I think there's a really powerful path in the future to just the automation of our manual activity, the automatic transcription of our manual activity, so that we can get to a point where we're talking about real insights and coaching people to real behavior. There is a future for sales and for humans in a world of automation, but it has to do with doing things that only humans can do. And recording that something happened is just something that machines can do as well as humans. So that's my thought for the day. We want to thank our sponsor. Our sponsor for the offsite was InsightSquared. They do amazing work. Our sponsor for this episode of the Sales Hacker Podcast is Outreach, the leading sales engagement platform. Outreach supports sales reps by enabling them to humanize communications at scale, from automating the soul-sucking manual work that eats up selling time to providing action-oriented tips on what communications are working best. Outreach has your back. Again, as I said at the outset of the show, I hope everybody's doing well out there. I know that here at Revenue Collective, we've moved to, again, March 18th. Who knows what's going to happen the first week of April? But as of March 18th, we're doing a webinar a day at this point, just as a way of bringing community together for executives and for people out there that are feeling isolated. And I really encourage you, whether it's a community like Revenue Collective or your own company, I think it needs to be outside of just your company, but you need to find ways using, Zoom or video conferencing or teleconferencing or Slack or any kind of group messaging feature. You need to find some way of staying connected to groups of people and making it a point of doing that and a point of checking in with people, because otherwise you're just going to go stir crazy. And we don't want that. So hope you're doing well. If you have any messages for me, you can reach me, linkedin.com/in/Sam F. Jacobs. Revenue Collective launched Revenue Collective of Color in March, RCOC. So if you're a person of color and you're interested in joining the community, we've got a whole set of programming and a calendar and, a bunch of ideas. We're super excited about what we're going to be doing. So reach out to us if you're interested. We want to create on-ramps for all kinds of different communities for people so that they can get the professional development and career enablement they need. And that's what we're doing at Revenue Collective. So regardless, hope you're doing well out there. Wash your hands. Just keep 6 feet away from all other people. And we'll tackle this thing together. Talk to you soon.
You like the rough stuff, but